G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Miami Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before I get into all of the headlines and team considerations for this weekend, I just wanted to extend my thanks to each and every one of you watching this. I recently hit 4,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. I know it's not the biggest number going around, and that's completely okay. But the fact that there's been so much engagement and encouragement and support from all of you on this channel, on my Twitter page, etc., it has just been such a journey doing YouTube videos. I had until last year never even entertained the idea of creating F1 fantasy content or YouTube content for that matter. And the fact that there's been so many of you that have reached out on an ongoing basis and engaged in the comments, discussed teams, strategies, etc. It just goes to show how supportive this community is, and I really can't thank you all enough. This journey is really just so fun, and I'm so excited to continue doing this moving forward. So thank you again to each of you watching this. It's just, very happy and very pleased, and means a lot to me. So we'll get straight into the headlines for the race weekend. The biggest one I think that's drawn my eye has been the McLaren upgrades. They have talked about a number of tweaks to the car setup. Mercedes also expected to bring some changes to their car as well. But I think the fact that McLaren in particular, Lando Norris, in my eyes anyway, in the last few races, have made such good strides to really put them, or at least Lando put him in a position where he's able to contend with Red Bull and Ferrari in the last few races or so. He's had a podium in Australia. He had that P2 most recently in China. So he's very much looking the goods. I think also Oscar Piastri, even though he has had a pretty slow start to the season on all accounts, he hasn't broken more than 23 points, which was in Saudi Arabia, and is coming off 10 and 12 in Japan and China respectively. Just really isn't enough for someone at his price point in the game. But I think the fact that these upgrades are expected to move them closer to Ferrari, if not past them, if all things work out, means that they will no doubt come onto our radar, certainly for the limitless users in Miami. I'm not so sure if at the constructor's price point, at Oscar's price point, even at Lando's price point, they are viable week to week. But I think for limitless users, for 1 week punts, they are pretty decent value, and I assume the upgrades will only continue to improve how that car performs on track. So I've certainly got my eye on Lando for my limitless chip. I'm about 90% set on using it in Miami, only because he's in a very rich vein of form at the moment. As for Oscar, I'd really want to see a couple of top 4, top 5 placements from both of them in free practice 1 in the sprint qualifying to think about bringing Oscar in as well. And by that point, if they do look that good, the probably constructor then is also worth having in my limitless lineup. But as of right now, I think Lando is a lock, and Oscar is certainly on the table right now. Just want to see a little bit more from him in free practice and sprint quality. At 15% owned, you're not going to find anyone in the top 100,000 running Oscar Piastri in their teams just about. So it means that if he does have a banger of a weekend, I think your rank will certainly move further ahead than those running the standard Leclerc's, Perez's, Sainz at and around that kind of $19 to $22 million price point. So they're the team I'm going to be monitoring before the deadline, which is the sprint race on Saturday. And I'm certainly eager to see whether or not these upgrades actually come through, especially from what we saw last year in the midpoint of the season, where those upgrades put them almost at the front of the field with Red Bull. So if that's anything to go by, I think there's a lot of cause for optimism coming out of the papaya. Another thing to think about this weekend, if you haven't already used it, which we saw a lot of people do in China, is the limitless chip. I haven't yet used it, and the plan for me from very early in the season was to use it at one of the earlier sprint races. I wasn't really so keen on using it at China for reasons I've mentioned in my previous videos, but everyone that did do it and do it successfully came off very, very well off. Kudos to all of you that did use it. But I wanted to take a slightly more conservative approach. after getting burned by it at Coda. Now, I do have a little bit of skepticism heading into this weekend. The last Grand Prix I went to, which was a sprint race weekend, coincidentally was also when I activated the Limitless chip last year, which was Circuit of the Americas. That weekend resulted in disqualifications for Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. So I'm praying to the F1 fantasy gods we don't see anything like that this weekend when it comes to activating the Limitless at a sprint race I will also be attending. So fingers crossed for that. But that aside, I've got obviously these drivers on screen here, all of which should be front and center of Limitless thoughts. The case I will make for using it sooner in the season is that the longer you leave it, the more budget all other fantasy strategists will have to catch up to what would be considered the optimal team for Limitless. So let's say in 5 to 7, 8 races time, it could very well be that some fantasy strategists are running Red Bull, Ferrari, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, for instance, which is 4 slots as opposed to 3, which most people currently have in the form of Max or Checo and then Red Bull and Ferrari. So that's the reason why I think Limitless has a bit more viability in the first half of the season. If you haven't used it yet and you're not so keen on using it for Miami, then Austria is certainly an attractive track. Red Bull have a very good record there. Anything later than that, and we're really getting into like the last 6-7 races of the season, Brazil, Qatar, Circuit of the Americas, it'll all be too late by that point, I think, given so many of us would have enough budget to get to what is more or less an optimal-ish team. So my suggestion is to get rid of it sooner or later on one of the next 2 sprint race weekends. And we'll get into the different drivers and constructors that could make up your fantasy Limitless team in Miami, for instance. So a couple of different chips certainly come onto the radar for sprint race weekends. A lot of people, myself included, used No Negative in China. There was a lot of risk around that, and I thankfully had, well, I wouldn't say thankfully, but it was successfully used to the point that it offset the DNF from Valtteri Bottas. But we do arrive at a circuit in Miami where we had no DNFs there in 2023. This is our 3rd year racing there, so the drivers are a little bit more familiar with it than, say, the Shanghai circuit would be. And it's also going to be a pretty warm weekend. I know there's been talks of scattered showers or some precipitation over the weekend, but I don't think it's going to be enough to completely worry me even running Limitless. So I'm not so sure if No Negative is an absolute must use. The one thing I will say though is if you're running Max Verstappen, which I'd recommend getting in if you can afford him, is that more often than not you're probably going to be left with Williams and Sauber drivers, which is by no means the most exciting combination of drivers in your lineup. But that comes with a degree of risk. Logan Sargent, I won't stop destroying him in terms of his DNFs. He's survived so far this season through 5 Grand Prix. I think it's only a matter of time until his luck runs out. And then we obviously know that Sauber's, even though they've improved with their wheel nuts, still seem to have some, I think, issue there. So we'll just have to keep that in the back of our minds running teams of this build. So if you're worried that Sauber and Williams may have a DNF or 2 due this weekend, then I would think about using the No Negative chip. Otherwise, you could probably hold on to it for one of the other sprint races later in the season. And the reason I say sprint races is that there is just an extra session worth of driving that drivers could DNF. So the risk is heightened, and that's why I'd suggest probably using it at the sprint weekends to mitigate the extra possibility of DNFs occurring. Limitless, I've talked about already. I've got some combinations here. Red Bull, Ferrari, Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc, and Norris are probably 6 of the 7 assets I'm leaning towards having in my team as of right now. The McLaren upgrades might change my thought process as to whether or not I bring in Piastri, maybe even the McLaren constructor, but I'd have to see a lot in that pre-practice and sprint quali to go down that route. I've also got as that 5th driver on the screen here, Piastri, again, going back to those McLaren upgrades, Carlos Sainz, which I thought was more of a sure thing a week ago, and it's funny how quickly the narrative can change for certain drivers. But I just think he looked a little out of sorts in China. If he can kind of turn it around in free practice, then I might well swing him back in. And then as a real roughy pick, Hamilton or George Russell, I wouldn't say either of those two for me are drivers I'm jumping at the idea of owning on a limitless chip, just because Mercedes have looked pretty rubbish. But those upgrades that they are bringing to Miami could do something. So if I see an inkling of performance from the Silver Arrows, then maybe Lewis Hamilton comes on to my team. But right now, I'm not so sure he will be sitting on the fringes at the moment. As for wildcard, you could be in a situation where you had a budget building team of sorts heading into China. You've used your limitless chip and you're coming into Miami with only 2 trades, but you want to go to a max build. If you're taking more than a -10, I would seriously consider using the wild card, but you could also probably just go to a max build Ferrari and Red Bull for a -10. I did that in China. I think it's certainly okay. And that -10 should hopefully be offset by the max output over an entire sprint race weekend. So a lot of chips to think about, a lot on the table. And I definitely think any of these 3 chips are viable if you're thinking about weighing up one of them for Miami. Now, in terms of how my team is looking for this weekend, I have this team from China. I've talked about possible combinations in my team selection video and also just before. But I think realistically, if I'm not going for limitless, which would take a lot for me to pivot away from at this point, I have to see some really discouraging results in free practice 1 and sprint quality from Ferrari and McLaren, for instance, and even maybe Red Bull, which I just don't see happening to be dissuaded from owning any of them on limitless. So as of right now, I'm probably like 80%, 90% leaning towards Red Bull and Ferrari as my 2 constructors. So if we take them out, I know I had this team in my team selection video if you've seen that already, but realistically, the team could look something like this. 8.7, I'm obviously not going to activate it now, but I think that 5th slot could be filled by anyone from Carlos Sainz, Oscar Piastri, or the Silver Arrows down here. Fernando Alonso, I don't know if he's worth a shout on limitless. I just think there's more upside in Mercedes assets, even in McLaren assets, definitely, and certainly Ferrari. So I'd probably steer clear of Fernando Alonso. You want to be going for the most expensive drivers for that 1 week. So Fernando is just not really jumping at me as of right now. Happy to eat my words if he has a podium on the weekend, but I just don't see it happening at this point in time. And then I've also talked about non-max Red Bull and Ferrari teams and non-limitless teams heading into the United States Grand Prix if you decide to, say, build budget for one more weekend. Now, I think you've still got to run Red Bull, Ferrari, and if you're not going for max. And I think Perez is more than likely right now the best driver to own on the 2X. You know, Leclerc you could certainly put in there if you're constrained on budget. I mentioned Lance Stroll as a great budget building asset until he gets past that 15 million price threshold as a C-tier asset. I'd probably look at getting in a Hülkenberg or a Kevin Magnussen if you can afford that. And then look in terms of lower owned, more affordable assets. Could be something like this, a bit of coverage across all 3 teams. So something like that, I think, is the framework and the foundations of a good non-max Red Bull and non-limitless team for this weekend. But I'm going to park it there for now, guys. It's getting quite late here. It's been a busy day. But I am going to be back with FanAmp, Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, with the deadline stream on Saturday morning before the deadline, Eastern time, in the US. So be sure to drop by for all of your burning questions answered. Team selection dilemmas will be on stream for an hour. So details are in the video description below. Be sure to check that out. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now, guys. As always, good luck with your teams this weekend. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.